The same hand that brought the famine is the same hand that took Elimelech's life. And that very same hand is the one who brought Ruth into the field of Boaz. So beginning from chapter 2 and verse 1, we read this. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So the story now introduces the third of the three main characters. The readers now made aware of this man Boaz. We're made aware of his connection to Elimelech. He's of the clan of Elimelech, which a clan is just simply a subdivision of a tribe. So he's of the clan of Elimelech. The reader immediately recognizes the significance because we talked about Elimelech in chapter 1. And Elimelech being the father of the family. Now we read of this man Boaz, who is of the same clan. And we read that his name is Boaz. And so we're already told a little bit about him. The name Boaz doesn't appear anywhere else in Scripture as the name of another person, but it does appear one other instance in Scripture as the name of, not a person, but an object. When Solomon finishes the construction of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 7, he names the north pillar and the south pillar, the two central pillars of the temple. He gives them names, and the pillar of the north side of the temple is given the name Boaz. So an interesting connection there. This pillar of the temple, the name Boaz literally means something like in the strength of Yahweh or in the strength of Jehovah our God. He names this pillar. So just as the pillar is like this pillar of the temple, so also is Boaz something of the pillar of the community, as we'll see as we move forward. But this name Boaz, meaning something like the strength of Yahweh, we read that he's called a worthy man, or your translation might have something like a man of substance, or a man of wealth, or a mighty man. This is a word that has a very wide range of meanings. We find this word used quite a bit in the Old Testament to describe all kinds of people. In Judges chapter 6 and verse 12, it describes Gideon as a mighty man of valor. We see the same word used to describe David's mighty men, his sort of inner core of elite warriors. 2 Samuel 17 and verse 8, it describes David's mighty men. Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 10, it describes the Proverbs 31 woman. So it always has a positive application, but it means everything from a man of wealth or a person of means, a person of substance, a person of valor, of military experience, of military power, of strength. It means a person of standing, a person of influence. And so this wide range of meanings can mean a lot of things for this man Boaz, but it always means something very much positive. And so we're given this positive view of this man Boaz. He's a man of standing in the community, a man who is respected. We'll see how the elders of the city treat him in chapter 3, and we'll see that he's a man of influence. When he speaks, the elders of the city seem to listen, and they gather to hear what he has to say. We're going to see in chapter 2 here that he's a man of means. He's a man of moral courage. He's a man of outward righteousness. We'll see all these things in this man Boaz. But now we're introduced to Boaz, but then the story leaves Boaz, and it takes a turn back in verse 2, back now to Ruth. But in verse 2, Ruth becomes, for the first time, the centerpiece of the story. She becomes the center character, beginning in verse 2 for chapter 2 here. And we read this in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. So here we see the fourth of our brackets. Remember last Sunday we talked about those three brackets in which the author is using phrases to direct our attention, to direct our thoughts where he wants to direct them. So here we see the fourth occasion in which he uses these types of brackets. And we see the words in verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said. If you look down to verse 21 of the same chapter, we see the same words, and Ruth the Moabite said. So there is another set of brackets, bracketing basically most of chapter 2, with the exception of the last sentence or so. But what this does is this brackets off chapter 2 to say the focus now is going to be on Ruth and her foreign condition, her alien condition, her status of being a foreigner, a sojourner, an alien in the land. This is what chapter 2 is going to focus on. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean. So here she says, let me go to the field and glean. By glean, she means collect some barley harvest. But it's a different thing from just harvesting. We find even a different word than what the word that was used in chapter 1, verse 22 to describe the harvesters or the harvest. This is the word translated glean. And it's basically doing the same thing as harvesting barley, but it's doing it in a different way. Or it's doing it, I should say, from a different perspective. Instead of the harvesters harvesting the crop for the owner of the crop, instead this is gathering some of the remnants of the crop for personal use. So this gathering, this gleaning that's taking place, what this is a reflection of the law of God, of the providence of God, and His care and His concern for the poor and the outcast and the foreigner and the sojourner of the land. We find three times in the Old Testament scriptures this providence or this law regarding gleaning. Most specifically, we find it in Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 10. There's a description here of the law of gleaning, in which the farmers are told that when they harvest the crop, they're to leave the corners unharvested. So as they go around maybe a rectangular field, they're not to glean or they're not to cut the harvest all the way up to the corners. They're to leave the edges. And then as they're collecting up the harvest and they're tying it up in bundles, they are not to stop and pick up those pieces that they drop. They're not to go back over the field a second time, but instead those pieces of barley or those pieces of wheat that are missed the first time are to be left. The same thing applies with the vineyard. They're not to go back over the grapes a second time, looking for those grapes that they might have missed the first time around, or as they're gathering them and putting them in baskets and some might fall out, they're to leave those. And the purpose is that the poor of the land are to come by, and that is what that they can then gather. This gleaning that they gather is then their source of food. It's their means of providing for themselves. So she says, let me go and glean. So she now has been made aware of this law, of this provision of gleaning that is in place in the land of Israel. As her and Naomi have come back, perhaps Naomi is the one who has told her of this, or perhaps someone else in the town of Bethlehem has told them of this practice of gleaning, and she says, let me go and glean. So let's think for just a moment about just what a remarkable thing that God has provided for in His law for the poor of the land. We see in Leviticus chapter 19 there, we see that this law is specifically geared toward the poor of the land, specifically the widow and the sojourner, of which Ruth is both. And this law, this provision of gleaning, is intended to provide something for two groups of people. First, it provides for the farmer the teaching, the context that's necessary to teach the farmer the law or the rule or the principle of generosity. It teaches the farmer to be generous with his crops. So think of this from the perspective of the farmer. The farmer has bought the seed, he paid for the seed, he planted the seed, he sowed the seed, or he paid his employees to sow the seed. His land grew the crop, and his people are now harvesting the crop, but we're told that part of his crop is not his own. Part of his crop belongs to others. Part of his belongs to the poor. And God puts this in such a way as to say, if you take from the gleanings, you are taking something from others, from the poor. So imagine now the perspective that this teaches the farmer that though these were my seeds, though this was my land, though I did the work, part of this is not my own. Part of what God has given to me belongs to others. What a great principle to be taught in God's law, that part of the resources that come from your work, part of the fruit of your hands, part of the fruit of your labors is not yours, but is owed to the poor of the land. So this teaches the farmer the principle of generosity. On the other hand, it teaches the poor something else, and it does both of this while providing a means for the poor to eat. What it teaches the poor is this. It teaches them that the economy of the land, the system of the land, the social network of the land is to be established in such a way to provide the poor an opportunity to work for themselves, to provide for themselves. It preserves the dignity of the poor. It preserves the dignity of the widow, the dignity of the farmer, And it preserves that by not just giving them a handout, but instead it provides a means or an opportunity by which they are able to eat by the fruit of their own hands. So you see how beautifully the system works. Instead of insulting them, instead of offending their dignity, or just to put it another way, it would be unloving to the poor to say to them, since you're poor, let's just give you everything that you need to eat. It would also be unloving to the farmer to say to the farmer, listen, you just keep everything that you grow and it's all yours. And so you might, if you wanted to turn to Leviticus 19 in your own Bibles, I know it's in your notes there, but if you were looking at this in your own Bibles, you would probably see a subheading right above that says something like, love your neighbor as yourself, or loving neighbor, something like that. My Bible has a subheading like that, love your neighbor as yourself, because this is the directive of God as to how to love the poor well. A society loves the poor well by ensuring that there are mechanisms or means or opportunities by which those who are disadvantaged are able to earn something of their own living and of their own keep. Likewise, this is loving the farmer by saying to the farmer, listen, we want to protect you from greediness. We want to protect you from thinking that when you give to the work of the Lord, you're giving something from your own means. Instead, we want you to understand that you are simply giving what was already owed to them, what God intended for them to have by way of your hands and by way of your land and by way of your seed. You see how that works. So you can also see just how far we've strayed from such a system that exists within our economy today. We all, as good Christians, we all should have a heart for the poor. We should also have a soft place in our hearts for those who are in a position in life in which they're disaffected or disenfranchised, and maybe they're having a difficult time. Instead of how our society so often treats that, which is to say, here is a handout to help you in this time. Instead, a society, a godly society, should endeavor to have means and mechanisms in place to afford opportunities that those who are disadvantaged can then provide for themselves. So you see the beauty of God's law here, this law of gleaning. So she says, let me go to the field and do this gleaning. Now, as we think about her going to the field to do the gleaning, make sure that you have in your mind this picture, this idea of what she's going to do that is not pleasant. Gleaning in the field would not have been a pleasant duty. It would not have been any sort of romantic idea of her just sort of strolling along, picking up grain and taking it home to eat. Instead, this is hard menial labor in which one spends virtually the entire day bent over. And then not only are they doing this hard menial labor out in the sun, but also they are doing it in a rather humiliating type of way, because everybody in the field knew the difference between the reapers and the gleaners. And so the gleaners who were there to glean the fields, everyone knew that they were the poor. They were the ones who didn't have their own means. And so they are there to gather for their own food by means of the graciousness of the farmer, so to speak. So it's both a menial job, it's a menial task, and it's not a very glamorous type of task. But still, she says, may I go out and glean in the fields among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. That's the same word that's often used for grace there. Find grace in his eyes or favor in his eyes. We find the same word in, for example, Genesis 6 and verse 8. Noah found favor with God. Or Genesis 39, how Joseph found favor with the head of the prison there. And so she says, may I go out behind him in whose eyes I find favor. That just simply means that she doesn't know. She doesn't know whose field she might end up in. And she said to her, this is now Naomi, she said to her, go, my daughter. So we don't really know the sense in which she said, go, my daughter. We don't, unfortunately, have the tone of the way that people speak recorded for us in the Scripture. And so we don't know if she said it sort of snarky like, well, go ahead. Or she might have, I think she probably said something more like this, something more of a resignation, in which Naomi said something to the effect, I wish it wasn't this way. I wish we didn't have to live this way. I wish you didn't have to do this, but we both recognize that you do. So go ahead, my daughter. Now, verse 3, so she set out and went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Second time now that we're told Boaz, clan of Elimelech. I think the writer wants us to see that and see it clearly. Boaz, clan of Elimelech. So she just happened to come across this field. Now, if you're reading in the King James says this, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was the kindred of Elimelech. Now, a couple weeks ago, when we looked at Ruth's departing speech, we made note of the fact that we are glad that we haven't thrown away our King James. Not because it's the most accurate of the translations, but because it is indeed the most beautiful. And so we looked at Ruth's departure speech, and we just took the time to look at that from the King James language because it is so poetic and so beautiful in its expression. So we're glad that we still have that. But now here looking at this passage, this makes us glad that we also have modern translations as well, because as the King James says, and her hap was to light upon the field belonging to Boaz. I doubt any of us, if we read that phrase apart from the context, we would really know what her hap was. But it's just an old way of saying she happened or she chanced upon this. And so we're glad that we have our modern translation that makes that a little clearer for us. But basically what the writer is saying is something akin to our modern vernacular of, and luck would have it. And as chance would have it, she happened to come across the field of Boaz. Now the writer says that, but he actually says it in a way that's even more forceful than that. There is a particular rhetorical or literary technique that's often employed in the Hebrew, in which when a writer wants to emphasize a verb, he will do something called doubling the verb. He will double the verb. He will take the verb and use it 2 times in a row, the first time in the infinitive and the second time in the imperfect. So it sounds something like this. And to walk, I walk. If I were to really emphasize the fact that I'm walking, I would say, and walking, I walked. Something like that. Well, that's a technique called doubling. And a writer only uses that when they want to put extreme emphasis on a verb that takes place in a sentence. The writer's going to use that technique 3 times in chapter 2. This is the first. So he doubles the word for chance. And so literally he says, and chancing, she chanced. In other words, he is putting heavy emphasis on this word chance, or the idea of chance, or happenstance, or coincidence. And so why would he do that? Why would he put such emphasis on she happened to come across the field of Boaz? In one of the books of the Bible that most clearly speaks to us of the providential hand of God working unseen in all the events of the story, why would the writer emphasize chance so much? And I think the reason is the writer is just putting this awkward amount of emphasis on chance as if to say, wink, wink, and she happened upon his field, or this was really coincidence, as though the author wants to stand up and scream to us, you can't really believe that this was coincidence, can you? You can't really believe that this happened by chance. Instead, the same hand that brought the famine is the same hand that took Elimelech's life. And the same hand that took Elimelech's life is the same hand that took Mahlon and Chilion's life. And that very same hand is the one who brought Ruth into the field of Boaz. Now, this is going to be the providential work of God. And it's going to be the providential work of God in at least 2 ways. First, Boaz must be of the right clan. And the writer's told us twice now that he is of the right lineage. He's of the clan of Elimelech. But also, Boaz must be something else. Boaz must be a man of kindness and generosity. Because if Boaz is of the clan of Elimelech, and Ruth comes to glean in his field and he shoos her away, or he has his reapers tell her to leave and go somewhere else, we don't glean over here, then we're still in the same position of having the providential seed of Messiah threatened. In order to preserve the seed of Messiah, which is a major theme of the Old Testament, preserving the seed of Messiah, in order for that to be preserved, the providential hand of God has to bring about the kinsman redeemer, as we'll see, the one of the right clan, and he has to be a man of great kindness and generosity, and he has to be accepting of Ruth, the foreigner, into his field. So here we begin to see this working of God's hand. Now, she chanced upon chance to come into his field. So from Ruth's point of view, this is exactly what's happened. You ever said that to yourself? It just happened to work out like this, and boy, God did a work through that. Well, no, it didn't just happen. It didn't chance upon chance. That was the providential hand of God working. But the providence of God is something that is rarely ever seen in the present, never seen in the future. But the providential hand of God, if it's ever going to be seen, will always be seen in the past, won't it? It'll always be seen looking backward, like John Flavel, the Puritan, once wrote that the providence of God often has to be read like the Hebrew letters backwards, just like you have to read the letters of your life or the events and the incidents of your life. So often you can look back and you can see how God used circumstances and events. You never would have seen that as they were happening, and you certainly wouldn't have seen that into the future. But just as Ruth looks upon this, and she happens to chance upon the field of Boaz, we, the reader, know there's no way. God, of course, is directing all of this.